It's my great pleasure to introduce Stephen Little. Stephen introduced me to Daoism and how it dovetailed with the history of alchemy. And I was more than a little excited when Stephen, at the very first, when he heard that I was doing an exhibition on alchemy and wanted to look at it from a global viewpoint, that he just immediately volunteered to come and speak at any time about it. And because I was getting ready to wheedle and whine and beg him to come and talk about Taoist alchemy. So let me introduce him. Stephen Little is the Florence and Harry Sloan Curator of Chinese Art and the head of the Chinese and Korean art departments at LACMA, Los Angeles County Museum of Art. World-famous authority on Asian art. Stephen grew up in Indonesia, Cambodia, Myanmar, and Turkey. Got his BA from Cornell, MA from UCLA, PhD from Yale. He served as curator of Chinese art at the Asian Art Museum of San Francisco, 77 to 82, Cleveland Museum of Art, 87 to 89, curator of Asian art at the Honolulu Academy of Arts. I should stop mentioning years because there is no time, he's just moving through space. He is the Pritzker curator of Asian art at the Art Institute of Chicago, and then director of the Honolulu Academy of Arts before moving to Los Angeles in 2011. His research interests include Chinese and Japanese painting, Chinese calligraphy, Chinese ceramics, classical arts of Southeast Asia, and European Old Master paintings. His publications, brilliant one, Daoism and the Arts of China, followed by New Songs on Ancient Tunes, 19th to 20th century Chinese painting and calligraphy from the Richard Fabian collection, Chinese paintings from Japanese collections, published 2014, and his newest book, which is absolutely stunning, 17th century Chinese paintings from the Cao family collection, just came out. He is currently working on a major exhibition focusing on the Ming Dynasty painter Chu Ying, which will open at LACMA in 2020. So even though curators don't think about time, registrars make sure that we do. Little is taught at the University of Virginia, Case Western Reserve, University of London, the School of Oriental and African Studies, the University of Chicago, and some school called Harvard University. Please join me in welcoming Stephen Little. Thank you.
Thank you, David. It's a real honor to be here. I feel a bit of an interloper in this colloquium devoted mostly to Europe. But I'd like to just take the time this afternoon to give you a very brief introduction to alchemy in China. It's a vast field. It enjoys an antiquity at least as ancient, as long as the European. Alchemy in China also has a vast literature in classical Chinese, very little of which is even familiar today to most sinologists. So it's the study of alchemy outside of China is really in its infancy. There's a considerable history in Japan. And I've been interested in it since my mother, when I was in college, made the mistake of sending me a translation of the Tao Te Ching, the most ancient classic work of Daoism. So I'm just going to skip a stone. It's going to hit a few points. I'm going to give a very broad introduction to the two major and parallel trends of alchemy in China. And I'd like to begin with just a bit of background on Daoism, because alchemy in China comes out of a tradition that is Taoist. And Taoist is we think of it usually in the West as a philosophy, if I can use that term, the West. I think you know what I mean. But we think of Taoism usually as a philosophy, first articulated in about the 5th century BCE by the sage Lao Tzu in his great classic Tao Te Ching, meaning the Tao and its power. And this is a 15th century painting on silk of Lao Tzu, who is the aged philosopher almost always shown holding a fan, leaving China. Usually he's said to have lived to a great old age. He was an archivist and a diviner at the royal court, roughly at about the same time that the Parthenon was built. He was very wise, and at an old age, he just got fed up with humanity and decided to leave China. And so he is usually shown in Chinese painting riding on an ox as he leaves China, headed out somewhere towards Tibet. Here he is given an ox cart. And as he leaves China, the frontier guard notices that an extraordinary person is coming and stops him and asks him to dictate his wisdom, at which point he dictates the 5,000 words of the Tao Te Ching, this great ancient classic. So this is the moment that the concept of the Tao is first articulated in Chinese history. So what is Tao? Tao means two things in Chinese. Tao means a road or a way. And so in English, the word Tao is usually translated as the way of all things, the way of the universe. But Tao also means to speak. It has two meanings, and that's typical of many Chinese words. For example, the very first line of the Tao Te Ching uses those two meanings in their different ways. The Tao that can be spoken of is not the true Tao. So if you're speaking about it, you've missed the boat. It's already too late. It's too mysterious. It's empty. It's an empty void from which all reality springs. And that's an important concept when we come to alchemy. So we'll come back to that later. But you might think of Tao as an empty void that is simultaneously pregnant. Now that's bordering on paradoxical, and I bring that up because the entire Taoist tradition is rooted in paradox. And much of the language of alchemy in China is also highly paradoxical. So it's a fundamental aspect of how the Chinese looked at the world in ancient times, that they appreciated the paradoxical aspects and the ambiguous aspects of reality. Chinese alchemy is very much rooted in the Chinese worldview and the ways the Chinese viewed the origins of the world, the origins of the universe, and the mechanics of the universe. So let me give you now very briefly a Taoist account of the genesis of the world. Imagine that initially there's nothing. There's just Tao, and the Tao is empty. And at some point, spontaneously generated by the Tao, out of the Tao, comes energy, which the Chinese call qi. And this energy swirls in a chaotic state for many eons. Until then, spontaneously generated out of the Tao come two forces which we've all heard of, yin and yang. These forces are invisible, they are complementary, and they cause the energy, the qi, which has up to this point been swirling in a completely chaotic state, to begin to move in patterns that are regular, that are predictable. The seasons could be accounted for this. But yin and yang move always in a kind of asymmetrical balance. And almost anything, any natural phenomenon could be explained in Chinese antiquity by reference to the interaction of yin and yang. So there developed from this many correspondences. So this is the classic yin-yang symbol, it's actually not called the yin-yang symbol in China. It's called Tai Ji Tu, or the diagram of the supreme ultimate. But, and just imagine, this is a photograph of a Ming Dynasty book, so it's abraded and it's a bit worn, but imagine that this part is all black and that this is white, as you see. The circle is the totality of the Tao, and within that is this constantly shifting balance of yin and yang energies, and always within yang there's a bit of yin, and within yin there's a white dot there of yang. So that's the basic fundamental notion that the world is created without a plan, it's created spontaneously, there is no will, there is no direction, but it happens. There is no God directing this. The most ancient symbols in China of yin and yang are the tiger and the dragon. The tiger symbolizes yin, Yin is also associated with the female gender. Yang is represented by the dragon and is identified with the male gender. And as we'll see, there are a whole series of correspondences that develop out of this. This symbolism of tiger and dragon we now know to be very ancient. It's actually prehistoric. And in 1988, there was a Neolithic tomb dating probably between 3,000 and 4,000 BCE discovered in Henan province, in which several people had been buried, and the central figure here has on one side the dragon and on the other side the tiger. It's a little hard to tell here. These are sculptures made of shells, of seashells in central China. But the tiger, and you'll have to take my word for it, actually has stripes. And it's significant if you look at where north is here, that the dragon is on the east and the tiger is on the west. And the dragon symbolizes the east. It's the direction where the sun rises. And the yang force embodied in the dragon is associated with the east with heat and with the sun. The west associated with the tiger is the yin direction. And we'll come back to that duality later when we get to alchemy. Now, the dragon is also a complex symbol. In China, dragons are extremely auspicious. So anytime you see a dragon, something fantastic will happen. Dragons not only symbolize the yang force, they can symbolize the Tao in its totality. And it is also a symbol of the emperor, so it's really a multivalent symbol that appears already in the Stone Age or in the Neolithic period. It's interesting to me that this reptilian beast is also plays, or similar reptiles play a role in European alchemy with the Ouroboros, usually shown as a snake, but here a bit more dragon-like. But it's interesting to me, and I'm curious that the dragons are so often in European art predicted as malevolent, that in the alchemical tradition it's something quite fantastic and wonderful. Now, I mentioned that the Chinese could explain all phenomena in terms of the interaction of yin and yang energies and the ways in which they force or they influence the qi energy of which all things are made. That's a fundamental notion in Taoist cosmology. By about the 10th century BCE, which is when it is thought that the I Ching, the Book of Changes, was first articulated, the continual cyclical flux of yin and yang energies starts to be symbolized by what's known as the 8 trigrams. And so the 8 trigrams are a series of, 8 symbols consisting of parallel lines, some of them unbroken, some of them broken. So yang in its extreme phase is symbolized by 3 unbroken lines. Yin in its extreme phase is symbolized by 3 broken lines, and then this is the cycle like this. So summer, for example, would be yang at its extreme moment. Winter would be yin, the yin trigram. There are 2 versions of these diagrams. This is the diagram of these 8 trigrams in their sort of, how to put it, as they appeared before the genesis of the world. You might imagine this is a Platonic ideal state where everything is symmetrical. I mean, in a kind of symmetry. So yang is directly opposite yin. And then you'll see how the balance shifts. We have 2 unbroken lines and then a single broken line. This is the same set of trigrams, but in this world, in the phenomenal world, where things are asymmetrical and always moving and always in flux. So I think there are, and then I should say the interaction of yin and yang energies on the qi creates the 5 elements. Now, we've heard a lot about the 4 elements today, and I think this morning about the 5th element of ether. There are a few correspondences between the Greek elements and the Chinese elements, but I'll tell you what the Chinese ones are, because they correspond to yin and yang energies. 2 of the elements are fire, wood, earth, water, and metal. 2 of the 5 elements, or as they're also called phases, are yang. Those are fire and wood. Two of them are yin, which are water and metal, and one of them is neutral, neither yin nor yang, and that is earth, and that is in the center. So the 5 elements in China also correspond to the 5 directions. So one has to keep in mind in almost every Asian culture that the directions are always conceived of as 5. The 4 cardinal directions, and the center is always a very important 5th direction, which, as I said, is neutral. In Chinese art, the 5 elements are usually depicted as 5 old men, who are just called the 5 elders. And there are many paintings of this, and I will admit, I only recently discovered that these are the primary symbols of the 5 elements. Sometimes they're shown in a forest looking at a scroll painting of the yin-yang diagram, which is just a straightforward cosmological, cosmogonic statement about how the Chinese imagine the world to operate, what the mechanics of the world are. So let me talk a moment about systems of correspondence. One thing that's fundamental to Chinese cosmology and also to Daoism and to Taoist alchemy is that the Chinese imagined that humanity lives between heaven and earth. Sometimes these are called the 3 realms, the Sancai, heaven above, earth below, and humanity in the middle. And these realms of heaven and earth are conceived of as mirrors. So an action properly done on this terrestrial plane will have its corresponding reaction in the celestial plane and vice versa. The planes are different. Heaven and earth are not the same thing, but they're similarly constructed. And so the Chinese always look at the world in terms of these correspondences on the biggest level between heaven and earth. The 4 directions, the 4 cardinal directions, have their animal symbols, which are 2 of which we've seen already. The dragon, which is here. These are roof tiles, over 2,000 years old, excavated some years ago outside of Xi'an in western China. The dragon of the east, the tiger of the west. The south is always symbolized by a bird, sometimes called a phoenix, but the phoenix is not a Chinese idea. Originally just called the red bird because there are colors that also correspond to these directions and to yin and yang. And finally, a very mysterious symbol for the north, a tortoise with a snake wrapped around it, which is called the dark warrior, Xuanwu, who later is manifested in anthropomorphic form as a god that protects from the north, which is a yin direction. So yin is always a direction, the north is a direction one always has to guard against in China. Most capital cities will have a mountain range just north, very much for that reason, if you look at Chinese geomancy or feng shui. So the Chinese were highly adept astronomers very early. This is a 13th century star chart carved into a stone stele. When it was made and designed in about the 1240s, it was the most advanced star chart ever made anywhere in the world. It comprises over 1,400 stars. It shows the circumpolar area here. The sky is divided into 28 sort of wedge-shaped segments, which are called the lunar mansions. These are the constellations in which the moon appears to rest in its orbit around the Earth. And then we also have the Milky Way, which you can see here. And they actually noticed the clouds of dust that obscure parts of the Milky Way. This is the ecliptic, which is the apparent, the ecliptic, I'm sorry, it's not the ecliptic, that's the celestial equator. If you imagine the equator on the Earth and just extend it out into space. So everything inside that is in the northern hemisphere, and all the stars outside are in the southern sky. And then this is the ecliptic, the apparent path of the sun through the sky. And this chart is sufficiently accurate, you could actually navigate with it today. It's quite a remarkable monument, and the actual stone still survives. So, yin and yang create, through their interaction, the 5 elements. The 5 elements are then correlated to colors, directions, the 5 visible planets, and many other things. So the Chinese were very aware that there are these multiple layers of existence that are all correlated. Now, mountains play a very significant role in Taoism and in alchemy. There are 5 sacred mountains, sacred peaks in the Taoist tradition. They are located in the 4 cardinal directions in the center. They are, some of them we know were considered sacred from the very earliest historical records, the oracle bones of the Shang dynasty. This is the central of the 5 sacred peaks in northern Henan province, Mount Sung. Like many of the sacred peaks, it is sacred to both Daoism and Buddhism, but Buddhism is a fairly late arrival in China. It first comes in the late 1st century. About the same time Vesuvius erupts over Pompeii, and Herculaneum is the first Buddhist temple built in China. But these mountains play a very powerful role in the Chinese imagination. There are many sacred mountains. These are just the most famous. And I mention them because they correlate to yin and yang and the 5 elements and so on. But mountains are places where Taoist temples are built. Taoist alchemy is performed and enacted and pursued. Mountains are places where the raw ingredients for alchemy come. Mountains are places where you encounter gods and immortals. And I'll talk about those and the distinction between them in a minute. This is one of my favorite Taoist temples in a really remote mountain in China in western Hubei province. If any of you saw the film Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon, that film ends on this mountain. And although the film doesn't tell you that, this mountain is sacred to the god of the north, Zhenwu, the god who starts out as the tortoise and snake. And the entire film is about that god's sword technique, because there's a lot of sword play in that film. But they never explain quite what's going on. Mountains are places, as I said, where you find the ingredients for alchemy, both mineral and plants. The early Taoists were fantastic pharmacologists. This is one of the early classic texts on mushrooms, which play a huge role in the Taoist tradition. And mushrooms were utilized for many different purposes. Some of them rather fantastic, I know. Caves play a big role symbolically in Taoism and in alchemy. Now, just to back up for a minute, it's only when Buddhism arrives in China in the 1st century and then flourishes in a period of disunion and political chaos in the next several centuries that Taoism becomes a religion. And we don't tend to think of Taoism as a religion. We tend to think of it as a philosophy about balance, about harmony, living in harmony with the natural world. But Buddhism arrives in China already 500 years old with an incredibly sophisticated literature, artistic tradition, and Buddhism is attractive throughout society, from the imperial level down to peasants, farmers, and Taoism had to do something. So by the end of the 2nd century, Taoism has evolved and developed into a religion. The sage Lao Tzu has been deified as a cosmic god, whose new name is Taishang Laojun, and literally the supremely high Lord Lao. A Buddhist church, if I may use that term, evolves with clergy, liturgy, rather complex liturgy, visions, and a vast pantheon of deities. Hundreds, if not thousands of deities, but significantly no supreme deity. There's never a supreme deity in Taoism. There's only the Tao, which is empty, which is the generator of all these things. So since the Chinese understood from a very early time, at least by the Bronze Age, by, say, the 5th century BCE, even though some of these concepts are not fully articulated in writing until the 3rd and 2nd centuries BCE, the Chinese understood a number of things. First of all, that matter and energy are interchangeable, since the fundamental cosmology is that everything is made of energy. So this lectern is made of energy. It's shocking that it took Albert Einstein to figure that out for us. But we now know that to be true. The lectern is mostly empty space. If I hit my head on it, I'll be injured, but it's still mostly empty space. Just because you can't see it doesn't mean it's not true. The Chinese understood this. They looked at the world in that way, that everything is in flux. So one of the primary fundamental notions of Taoism is that everything is changing. Nothing is fixed. Even gods come and go. Some gods have enjoyed great longevity. There are gods that existed that don't exist in China anymore. There are gods that are hugely popular today in China who did not exist before the 15th century. So that's just an illustration of how comfortable the Chinese have been in their tradition with flux, and their understanding that that is a fundamental notion. Now, I just want to speak briefly about caves. This is a Ming Dynasty painting of a very famous cave not far from Shanghai, near the city of Suzhou, which is associated with a particular Taoist saint. Caves were believed, especially caves in sacred mountains, were believed to be gateways to the Tao, gateways to paradise, because the mountain itself is conceived of as pure energy. And a particularly sacred mountain is perceived as energies that are so pure that they're what's left over from the creation of the world. They're very early, but they're changing. The mountain will come and go. The mountain will have a life like a human. It will be born, it will live, it will die. Planets will come and go. That was all very present in the Taoist imagining of how the world operates. In some caves, time was believed to move backwards, because in the practice of alchemy and the practice of Taoist self-cultivation in China, the fundamental goal is to revert to a stage of purity that the Tao embodies. That's what all alchemy is about in China. So there are certainly parallels with the European tradition. This is a wonderful Ming Dynasty woodblock print from one of my favorite books, The Complete Compendium of the Assorted Immortals. Illustrated biography of hundreds of immortals. This is an ancient immortal. This is the immortal here, Fei Changfang. And he is shown in the marketplace, and he notices this old man wandering around, and the old man says, would you like to become an immortal? After work, come over to my place, and he does, and the guy jumps into a gourd, this double gourd here, which incidentally symbolizes the joining of heaven and earth. And inside the gourd is a parallel universe. Now, if we had more time, I could tell you what happens there, but we don't have time for that. So the key thing, you can Google it. I think you can Google it. Fei Changfang. The key thing is that fundamental to Taoism and fundamental to Taoist alchemy is the idea that there are multiple parallel universes. This world that we see and live in here is but one possible manifestation of reality. So now, there are two categories of divine beings in the Taoist tradition. There are deities. Deities appear very early in China. In the Taoist tradition, some deities are, here's like a group photograph of a lot of deities. Most deities, I mean, there are high deities and low deities. The higher deities are pure energy, very highly purified forms of qi. And in the Taoist tradition, I suppose because China has always had a vast bureaucracy, heaven is perceived as a bureaucracy. So if you become a god, because some humans can become gods, there are deified heroes who are widely worshipped, usually in what's called popular religion, not Taoism per se. But if you become a deity in China, you will get a desk, you'll get a phone, you'll get an assistant, you'll get a fax machine, you'll have email, you'll have all the appurtenances of a bureaucratic office, and that is considered something fantastic. But remember the mirrors. If there's a big bureaucracy in this world, there's a major bureaucracy in the heavens. And they are mirror images of each other. And they operate in similar ways. So Taoist ritual is all about petitioning deities in heaven to answer the needs of the human community or the individual. So in a ritual, the Taoist priest will write out a petition. It might be about it could be about anything. It could be about the Yellow River flooding and people losing their homes. It could be a petition to help the emperor who might be mentally ill. I mean, it could be anything. Usually it should be something serious. So the priest writes out, after days of preparation and meditation, writes on specially prepared paper a petition, then embellishes that with talismans that are characters, in effect, that have no meaning in and of themselves, but are extremely powerful and can protect you from almost anything, can protect your grave, can bring you love, whatever you need, bring you money. They're talismans for anything. That petition is then burned and turns into smoke. The smoke transmits the petition to the heavens. Before you do anything, you light incense, because the incense will purify the space of the ritual altar, and I'll show you an altar in a few minutes, and attract the attention of the gods. When the gods smell the incense, they pay attention. Then you can deliver the petition. If the god does not reply to your petition after you have fed the god and taken care of the god and swept the steps of the god's temple, and he doesn't come through, get a new god. It's that simple. It's very pragmatic. So here we have just a few gods. These are mostly celestial gods of constellations, of the Chinese zodiac. As you may know, the Chinese zodiac also has 12 animal symbols, but unlike the Western zodiac, which is solar, the Chinese zodiac is not based on the month that you're born, it's based on the year that you're born, and it hinges on where Jupiter is in the sky, because Jupiter has an orbit of 12 years. So the Chinese zodiac is entirely based on the planet Jupiter. And each year in that 12-year cycle is symbolized by a different animal. So we have some of them here, not all of them. We have the deities of the 28 lunar mansions, the 5 visible planets, and so on. And the Chinese imagined most deities to live in the heavens. This is one of the most ancient, this is a stone, an ink rubbing of a stone carved panel in a tomb from Shandong province dating to, I think, the 2nd century CE. And this is one of the most ancient of the Taoist deities, Tai Yi, whose name means supreme unity, a classic Taoist god's name. And he is riding in the Big Dipper, which has 7 stars. And so the Dipper, which is the biggest constellation in the sky, and because all of China is in the northern hemisphere, the Big Dipper is always visible, as it is in the US and in northern Europe. The Dipper attains huge prominence in the Taoist tradition on many different levels. Now, it is significant, and we'll come back to this when we talk about alchemy in more detail, that because of this mirroring and these correspondences, many of these deities that live in the heavens also live in the human body. There are multiple forms. There are mirrored beings here. So this is a diagram. This one dates from about the 19th century, but this first appeared probably in the 4th or 5th centuries. It's a diagram of the human body visualized as a landscape. And this is significant, too, because of the symbolism of the mountain. There are mountains protruding from the head here. This is the spinal column. And this is a guide for meditation and visualization. We'll come back to that a little later, but I just wanted to point out the importance of the fact that the body was believed to be inhabited by different deities who have their counterparts in the heavens. And so if you were a sophisticated practitioner and a sophisticated adept, you could energize those energies and deities who are, after all made of energy. Their energy is just, their chi is just a bit more refined than ours, which is turbid. But you could move these energies around in your body. And what's really significant here in this diagram is that the body is visualized as a landscape. So landscape plays a very fundamental role in China, and even in some of the earliest writings about Chinese landscape painting, the theory and practice of landscape painting, it was not enough for an artist to depict the form of the mountain. An artist had to capture the energy of the mountain, because the mountain is energy, perceived as breathing, as moving, as living. And so when you look at a Chinese landscape painting, imagine looking at it in those terms, that you're looking not at a picture of a mountain, you are looking at a picture of patterns of energy moving through the earth. Okay, we talked about deities. Deities are usually pure spirit beings, by and large, within the Taoist tradition. The other class of divine beings are what are usually called immortals. Their earliest reference to these beings, which are human beings who undergo a major transformation physically and or psychically. They are called zhenren. Zhen means real, true. The word for Chinese, if you say to somebody in Chinese, oh, really? You say zhenda. Zhen means real, but it means realized. And it's typical of most Chinese words that it can be a noun, a verb, an adverb, an adjective. China is very fluid in that way. Or a xian. This character, xian, is a person next to a mountain. And like I said, usually this concept is translated in English, certainly as immortal, but the word immortal conveys a certain significance which really misses the point of what this practice and discipline is all about. Living forever, being an immortal, is a negligible byproduct of this particular discipline. First of all, to practice Taoist self-cultivation and alchemy, you have to cultivate your moral purity. So there were elixirs that were developed that were highly toxic. We've heard a lot today about this duality of mercury and sulfur in the Western alchemical tradition. In China, that prime duality is mercury and lead. Mercury symbolized by the dragon, yang. Lead symbolized by the tiger, or yin. And there are many, many other minerals and elements that are involved in alchemy, but those are the two most important. And of course, they're both highly toxic. So much early Chinese chemical alchemy involved the creation of elixirs that had many different purposes and functions, but the most powerful were essentially an express elevator to immortality. So you would consume them, you would die, big deal. That's not important. It's an express elevator to a pure state of being. So who are these immortals? I said there were hundreds of them. These are the saints of the Taoist tradition. They can intercede. They all start out as human beings. They all start out as you and me. There is no dogma about how you become an immortal. This is a distinctive aspect of Taoism. It is a profoundly non-dogmatic tradition. There's no one path. There are a myriad paths. And as Christopher Schipper, one of the great European experts on Taoism, has written, you never know who your teacher will be. You never will know the catalyst that will transport you into pursuit of perfection, of spiritual perfection, which is the goal, and unity with the Tao, which is a state of being. It's not a place. It's a state of existence. It is immortality or realization, I should say, in the Taoist tradition is about transcending the boundaries of yin and yang, transcending the boundaries which constrain us in this world, in this phenomenal world. It's about transcending time and space. The most famous of the immortals are a group of 8, and these are the two most eminent of the 8. The dean of the immortals, Zhongli Quan, who's shown here walking on water. So nobody has a monopoly on walking on water. He holds a double gourd. So if you see a figure in Chinese painting or Chinese art with a double gourd, it's a Taoist adept or transcendent. He usually has his robe open, a big belly, intense eyes. He is an alchemist. This is his main student, Lu Dongbin. His story is amazing. He's probably the most popular Taoist immortal in China. He meets Zhongli Quan one day, has a dream in which he dreams his entire life and career, which starts out fantastically, ends up badly, wakes up, and Zhongli Quan looks at him and says, "How was your dream?" And he's shocked and he says, "Yes, I want to do what you do." Lu Dongbin is a scholar. He's a writer. He's an alchemist. He's a swordsman. He's always shown with his sword, which has both exorcistic powers and other magical powers. He is the patron saint of winemakers, because his dream came about because he got drunk on wine, or was facilitated by that. He is the patron saint of ink makers because he's an incredible calligrapher and poet. A number of his alchemical poems actually exist. He's believed to have lived in the 9th century, although these Taoist figures reappear in many different dynasties because they've already transcended time. And these figures, who, as I said, function in the Taoist tradition as saints, can be many places at once. They can be in 40 different forms at once. They can walk through walls. They can perform miracles, and they can intercede on behalf of humans with higher deities. But they are not gods. They are realized beings. They're another category of being. And this is a wonderful 14th century painting in a private Japanese museum showing those two adepts, Zhongli Chen here, Lu Dongbin here, and it's called Zhongli Chen transmitting the secrets of alchemy to Lu Dongbin in the form of a little scroll here. And I love his intense blue eyes. This is a 600-year-old painting on silk. When you see an image of a Taoist adept and there's a little metal object like this next to it with some of the trigrams clearly visible on it, this is an alchemical reaction vessel. It is a crucible of some kind, and it symbolizes alchemy. And almost, I wouldn't say all, but many of the most important immortals or adepts were alchemists. Now, there are also, as I said, almost all immortals start out as ordinary human beings and encounters an event or a person or another adept who helps them overcome and teaches them the techniques of overcoming the boundaries of yin and yang, so they can exist outside of those constraints. There are many figures, artists in Chinese history who were believed, who we know were Taoist practitioners and are included in this illustrated Ming Dynasty assorted compendium of immortals biographies. One, this man Shi Kang, lived in the 3rd century CE, was the most famous player of the qin zither, which is one of the great instruments in the Chinese tradition. He was very fond of ingesting rocks, specifically stalactites, he and his teacher, which helped catapult them outside of the boundaries of yin and yang. Very few people know that. A lot of people know about his music, his theories of music, his musical compositions, but that he was a Taoist practitioner is sort of a well-kept secret. Okay, finally, alchemy. I told you already the primary purpose of alchemy is to transcend the boundaries of this world and achieve a state of union with the undifferentiated Tao. And there are many different paths to that point. So, there are in China 2 forms of alchemy. And I should just mention, the Chinese term for alchemy is this character pronounced Dan. It means cinnabar. It's the ore of mercury. Dan also, because cinnabar was widely used in painting, Dan is also part of a 2-character phrase, Dan Qing, cinnabar and blue-green or malachite, which is a classical term for painting. There's outer alchemy, Wai Dan. Wai is outside, which is, by the way, Dan also means a pill. It has all kinds of meanings. Wai Dan, or outer alchemy, is chemical alchemy. Chemical alchemy done in a laboratory, where you are manipulating minerals, herbs that embody the purest essences of yin and yang on the terrestrial level to attain transcendence. So there is a long tradition. Now, it's interesting. When we look at images of alchemists in Europe, at least from the period that we've been focused on today, 16th, 17th, 18th centuries, the alchemical laboratories either look something like this, and these can be straightforward or mocking. We've seen probably both. And I'm very intrigued by these images because they're full of symbols. Nothing in these paintings is arbitrary. The owl, the cat. Or my favorite, I mean, I want an office like this. This is my favorite illustration in Heinrich Kunrath's The Amphitheater of the Eternal, one of my favorite book titles. I just wish we could look at every page of this book. It's one of the most beautifully illustrated, printed alchemical books from Europe. I love that there are elements that are paradoxical within the European alchemical tradition. You know, the phrase on here, hasten slowly. Classic paradox. I'm showing you these images because in China, images of alchemy usually show the alchemical practice happening outdoors, in the mountains, in a forest, remote, far from cities. Although we do know from text that buildings were built as alchemical laboratories. Now, in this is also a 600-year-old painting on silk in the British Museum in London. It is an anonymous Yuan dynasty painting of 3 Taoist adepts or immortals in a forest, in a mountain forest. We have seen 2 of them already. Zhongli Chuan, the dean of the 8 immortals, the swordsman Lu Dongbin over here, and a third very popular immortal, Liu Haichan, who is always shown with a 3-legged toad. The toad is his vehicle. The toad has magic powers. The toad loves cash. So if the toad runs away, he just has to dangle some strings of cash, and the toad will come running very, very fast. But the toad can transport him into other realms. These figures, who look very rustic. I mean, a lot of Taoist immortals, their robes are tattered, they're barefoot, they look like they haven't had a bath for a long time, but they are profoundly divine figures. They are venerated throughout traditional China. They are saints, there are temples to them still today active in China. These 3 figures are seated around a crucible. So let's look at a detail. Now you'll see how damaged this painting is. It's quite abraded. I mean, it's a 600 or 700 year piece of silk. But on a rock is an alchemical crucible, and you'll have to take my word for it, but on here are the 8 trigrams. You can see it better if you go to the British Museum and ask to see it. And as in Europe, there are lineages of alchemists. Now, I'm assuming these were somewhat fluid even in the European tradition, but we've heard already of Hermes, Trismegistus, Maria the Hebrew, Cleopatra, and so on. Heraclitus. I think this is also from the Amphitheater of the Eternal. But there are similar lineages and branches within the Chinese tradition of chemical alchemy, as well as the other kind, inner alchemy, which we'll get to momentarily. So I'd just like to show you a few images of probably the most famous alchemists in Chinese history. The heyday of alchemy in China was the 4th, 5th, and 6th centuries. Everything in the alchemical tradition, by and large, had been fully established and articulated in writing by the end of the 6th century. It's all been downhill from there. This was a period of extreme disunion in China, the 6 dynasties period. It also happens to be when Buddhism flourishes in China. China is divided into north and south, sometimes myriad states fighting with each other. It wasn't until the end of the 6th century that China was again reunited under the sway and then the following Tang dynasty. When in the early 7th century, in the early Tang dynasty, Daoism was adopted as a state religion. The imperial Tang dynasty family identified with the sage Lao Tzu because they happen to have the same last name. That's fantastic for your political legitimacy. I mean, if you're directly descended from Jesus, that's powerful. So it's analogous. Ge Hong, one of the most amazing alchemists, his writings have been translated into English. He was a chemist. He was a notoriously curious intellectual. And here he is shown moving his family in a landscape. This is a 14th century painting. I'm just going to go very quickly. Tao Hongjing, probably the most famous alchemist, lived in the late 5th and early 6th centuries. A remarkable person, truly erudite, an imperial alchemist and swordsmith. And it's interesting, this was a time when many Taoist adepts in a particular tradition called Shangqing, or highest clarity, one of the earliest schools of Taoism, of religious Taoism. There were certain adepts who would go into trance and have visions, and in their visions, a deity of the opposite sex would descend from heaven and dictate to them recipes for elixirs, which would then be transcribed in a trance state, and then these became very, very powerful, very popular, and they started to be forged. They started to be faked. And the emperor of the Liang dynasty, Wu Di, in the early 6th century, by the way, this is exactly when the Buddhist monk Bodhidharma comes to China from India and has an audience with the same emperor who practiced Taoism and Buddhism simultaneously. Liang Wu Di employs Tao Hong Jing to determine which of these recipes that have been transmitted down since the 3rd century are genuine and which are fake. And Tao Hong Jing does this by his analysis of the calligraphy of the trance writer. And these are a series of letters between the alchemist and the emperor, and these are the earliest texts in all of Chinese history to discuss connoisseurship. Which starts with calligraphy, and then later texts develop about painting. But it's very interesting that all of this early history of connoisseurship, how do you judge quality in calligraphy, how do you judge authenticity in calligraphy, start in a Taoist context. Some of the most famous alchemists are women. Remember, yin and yang are equal in this world. Some of the most powerful deities in ancient China were female, the Queen Mother of the West being a great example. A deity who is still worshipped today in China, Shi Wangmu, because she can govern, among other things, the length of your life. She can determine your longevity. Being a divine manifestation of the yin force, her paradise is in the west, which is a yin direction. It's where the sun sets. And as in many other cultures, Egypt being a good example, the west is associated with death and consequently also with rebirth in a very big way. So here we see a scene from it's a 16th century Ming Dynasty painting, but here we see a scene in the in the 10th century of an imperial palace. The emperor is here and Lady Gang is doing alchemy for the court. She's turning snow into silver, to everyone's amazement. But she was very fond of drink and sex and died young. Rather tragic story. But there is also, I should mention, a whole Taoist sexual literature also, which is parallel to the alchemical literature, and that is also very early in its origin. Okay, Neidan, or inner alchemy, is different from chemical alchemy in that instead of manipulating things in a laboratory, one visualizes that entire process. So one uses the natural yin and yang energies in one's own body to create an inner elixir, and that happens in a specific part of the body called the cinnabar field, the dantian, which is located here. You see these 4 yin-yang symbols over a fire. It's just below the solar plexus, and that is where the inner elixir is created, the goal being to create a kind of divine embryo or divine child. We've seen images of that already this morning. This is one of the earliest known texts on inner alchemy. This is a guide to visualization and manipulating these inner energies of the body. It's called the Classic of the Yellow Court, and the earliest known example of it was written by the most famous calligrapher in all of Chinese history, Wang Shizhi, who lived in the 4th century. And this is still today, although the original doesn't exist and it's only known as from an ink rubbing. This is considered the finest example of standard script ever done, and it's significant that it's a Taoist text. And Wang Shizhi, the calligrapher himself, was, we know, a Taoist practitioner. Very, very serious. His entire family, some of his cousins' tombs have been excavated. They have found many cinnabar pills in the tombs, and an extraordinary person. One could write a whole book about him. These are examples of other visualization diagrams from the Taoist canon. This was last printed in the early 15th century. It's fairly rare today, and a complete original is in the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris, which Paul Pelliot brought from Beijing in, I think, around 1910. Notice the dipper here, very important as a guide. This is the practitioner. He is visualizing the deities of the Dipper stars, who are personified here. And then there are many manuals on these techniques of visualization. This is another late Ming Dynasty book from the early 17th century, just employing some of the early cosmological symbolism that we've seen already. The animals of the four directions corresponding to yin and yang, yin here, yang here, the crucible here. Another kind of crucible or alchemical vessel here, a four-legged vessel with a male symbolizing yang riding a tiger symbolizing yin, and vice versa, the female symbolizing yin riding the dragon symbolizing yang. So this is all about creating balance internally, which is necessary to properly manipulate these energies to achieve a transcendent state. There are long hand scrolls that exist which illustrate all of the visualization steps. I'm already over time, so I'm not going to go into this in detail. This is owned by the biggest Taoist temple in Beijing, the White Cloud Monastery. And here we have a Taoist altar. These are all things that are visualized by the practitioner. The tiger and dragon. The most famous elixirs were cycled 9 times, and so the visualization of 9 reaction vessels is often a key part of Neidan or inner alchemy. And there's an actual diagram of Taoist altar. You see the trigrams here. And the end point, here's the divine embryo. So when you attain that state of transcendence, you also exist in different universes simultaneously. And the end point is this, which represents the Tao. Emptiness, totality. So there are all these steps, and these are alchemical poems. And it's typical, and I'm sure this is true in Europe, that much alchemical language can be read both on the, all chemical language can be read on the chemical level and the spiritual level simultaneously. And like much European alchemical writing, the writing tends to be abstruse, difficult to interpret, open to interpretation, and often multivalent. By the Ming and Qing dynasties, by the last 500 years, when we see an alchemical reaction vessel, again, usually outside with a practitioner, this is the reaction vessel. You'll notice the jet coming out of it. By this time, the practice of chemical alchemy really had declined, and alchemy really was an internal visualization discipline by then. So by this time, and here's another example, a practitioner, an adept, in a cave, significantly with a reaction vessel. The presence of these reaction vessels in paintings are symbols of inner alchemy. That's it. Thank you. And it's lead.
And yet the symbol for Dom, for drug, it's cinnabar, and it's the perfected cinnabar baby is in.
Yeah.
I mean, there's lots of parallels.
And Mercury takes precedence. Mercury is always the most important.
And Mercury is the dragon, right?
Yes. Yeah. And
So why do you say that's completely important?
I didn't say that. I said Mercury is the most important.
No, I said earlier you were saying that cinnabar isn't really sort of the active principle that they look at in alchemy. They're looking at the dragon and the tiger as sort of the...
Yeah, they're looking to harmonize the essences of yin and yang. But cinnabar is very important. Absolutely.
When does most of the illustrations that you've shown, you say they're like under Han movie, the Han Dynasty, the stuff that's being practiced, I mean that laboratory alchemy is being practiced. When does it start being illustrated? When does it start being represented?
That's a good question. There's almost no art that can be called Taoist before the 12th century. we know from texts, we know from the Taoist canon, we know through linguistic analysis when certain texts were written, late Han, Six Dynasties, that chemical alchemy was widespread and that there were illustrations, but they don't survive. Yeah. So I would say, and also there were Taoism was at certain points repressed by imperial decree. The emperors usually patronized Buddhism and Taoism simultaneously, but if the Buddhists got a hold of an emperor and said, you know, Taoism, it's really dark and dangerous, there have been times when there have been prohibitions. Kublai Khan, who was the first Mongol emperor of China in the late 13th century, had all copies of the Taoist canon, which by that time comprised almost 1,500 texts, burned. That was a huge loss. The only printed canons we have now are from the 15th century, with maybe one or two fragments. But those are, you know, reprints of these earlier texts. So there's a lot we don't know. There's a lot of evidence we have to sort of imagine or retroactively project. Yeah.
There's an apocryphal tradition that Emperor Diocletian has all the books on Getty at Alexandria burned in like 300. I'm sorry.
Yes.
There's an Indian myth called the Churning of the Milk Sea.
Yeah.
In the Indian myth, the Churning of the Milk Sea, it's an alchemical myth, which, there's a tortoise and there's a snake, and on balance on top of the tortoise is a mountain, an axis mundi, mandara, and the gods and demons stand on either side and they churn it. And I'm wondering what the correlation might be between the symbol for the north, which I was unfamiliar with, of the tortoise and the snake, and it also was called, I believe, the Dark Warrior, and I'm wondering,
Yeah.
the alchemists in the West, goes through lead, goes through black. I'm wondering if there's any correlation there.
That's a very good question, and hopefully will be revealed in the next talk. But thank you. I don't know. It's a really good question. The presence of the snake also is the churning happens because the snake is being pulled back and forth. And that gives rise to Amrita, the elixir. Yeah.
I know, sorry, but is there anything you can say about that symbol from the north?
No, it's a real mystery as far as I know. I have never seen a good account of its origin. It is utterly mysterious. And the term Shren means dark. It also means mysterious. Yes.
I have to thank you for that lecture. I have never been so thoroughly educated and in such an enjoyable way on a topic that I didn't know about in 45 minutes.
Thank you.
But here's my question. We saw this morning fantastical images and beasts and the apocalypse. You've talked about elixirs, mushrooms came up, magical toads, visions and trances. Is there any evidence that sacred plants, hallucinogenic substances, or psychedelics were involved in either Asian or European alchemy?
Certainly in China, yes. And their effects are described in detail. Cannabis was widely used as an inducement to trance. And that was important in these revelations, and is specifically mentioned. Mushrooms, as you know, many of them are hallucinogenic. Their pharmacological effects were well understood. Yeah. Good. Thanks.
And now we'll go south. So I'm just going immediately, we're running a little bit late. So I just say how lucky we are to have the world's expert on Tantric Indian alchemy here in California, and even luckier that he drove down from teaching a class at noon from Santa Barbara to get here by 3:30 with a cold. Thank you, David. Gordon White, the J.F. Rowney Professor of Comparative Religion at UC Santa Barbara. Also Associate Research Fellow at the Centre d'études de l'Inde et l'Asie du Sud in Paris. He's the author of 5 books: Myths of the Dogman from 1991, Alchemical Bodies, Siddha Traditions in Medieval India, 96, Kiss of the Yogini, Tantric Sex, quote unquote, in its South Asian context, followed by Sinister Yogis, and also the Yoga Sutra of Patanjali, a biography. He's also the editor of Tantra in Practice and Yoga in Practice, as well as 100 articles, chapters, etc. Please welcome the world's expert who will give us a primer in Tantric alchemy, David Gordon White. Thank you.
Good afternoon, and thank you, David. Always a pleasure to be introduced by a David. These are the two sole images that we are fairly certain represent alchemical practices from the South Asian and Southeast Asian world from the time that people were practicing alchemy, tantric alchemy. The one is from a temple in India, the other from Angkor Wat in Cambodia. And I'll say a few words about why they are representative of Tantra, because the artistic context of both of these images is Tantric. Tantra being a religious current that transformed every South Asian religion between the 7th and 14th centuries. Tantric imagery and symbolism were very often erotic, albeit an eros tinged with thanatos in what has been termed the Tantric culture of the cremation ground. So this image from the Kandariya Mahadev temple in Khajuraho is on a wall of the temple not so far, from, oh dear, let's see, I want to back up, I don't want to go forward. Portraying, well, acrobatic sex. Now, we don't know if these are tantric sexual practices or simply sexual practices, but the fact is that every temple that was built in the tantric age, that is between about the 6th century and the 15th century CE, had erotic carvings on it. So there's an elective affinity between erotic carvings and tantra. That much we can say. So here in this particular carving, you see some sort of chemical practice alongside reverse sexual posture, which was also a feature of tantric sex. In the case of Angkor Wat, this is from the wonderful Bayon temple, the one that has all the faces on the spires of it. On a lower frieze of that temple, you have, I did it again, this image of two fellows, looks like they're mixing up the medicine there. And this is on a frieze that depicts a boat. I should say that Angkor Wat had, its priesthood was always tantric from the 6th century onwards. They were imported from India, those priests, and they were either Buddhist tantric or Shaiva, Hindu tantric priests. These are Shaiva, Hindu tantric priests, and Indian tantric alchemy was generally reserved to the Shaiva practitioners. We know it's Shaiva because this is a boat coming to the capital. There's fish swimming underneath. There's tantric practitioners in profusion on the boat. It's a very low bas relief, so it's hard to make out everything. But you know it's Shaiva because there's a trident, and there's a bit of, it's actually a temple spire. It's a floating temple. You can see there's the sort of the roof of the temple, someone sitting directly below that spire, and then there's our alchemist there. And these are the dreadlocks that were associated with Shaiva tantric practitioners in this period. However, there exists another artistic depiction of alchemical motif from the tantric age, however, and that can actually be linked to a specific set of Indic alchemical texts dating from the 13th to 14th centuries, and a specific alchemical practice that is described in at least 7 of those alchemical texts. However, the images I'll show you all date from a far later period, at which point alchemy was no longer being practiced, at least tantric alchemy in India. Furthermore, these images are Mughal miniatures. They were commissioned by Muslims. And finally, more interesting still is the fact that virtually the same description of the technique is found in 2 other world alchemical traditions, one of them Syriac, an 800 to 1000 CE work that actually Matteo Martelli translated for me, and you heard him this morning, and then a report by a 14th century Chinese source. And this alchemical practice was the topic of several paintings, what you have here is a maiden on a horse fleeing a surging flood of mercury that's coming out of a well. And this is the only one that's sort of a nocturnal image of this. All the others are diurnal, so you can see them quite a bit better. There you see the well quite clearly with the mercury surging out, the maiden running away on her horse. These are all 17th to 18th century images, and they're all Mughal. And there aren't that many of them. What I'm showing you is basically all the ones we know of. There's a couple. There's one on a wall in a palace in Rajasthan that I don't have here. And actually, I thank David for supplying some of these for me, most of these actually. All of the principal works on Tantric alchemy, the principal works, of which there are about 20, are written in Sanskrit. All are Hindu in their religious orientation. They're not Buddhist, they're not Jain, they're not Islamic. And nearly all make explicit reference to Tantra. Many of them call themselves Tantra in their title. And Tantra was this religious current that transformed virtually every South Asian religion between the 7th and 14th centuries. A distinctive feature of Tantra was its sacramental and magical use of male and female sexual fluids, which were homologized with the creative essences of the primal dyad, the phallic god Shiva, and his divine consort, Devi. She goes by many names: Parvati, Devi, Gauri, Shakti. The Tantric alchemists extended this homology to the mineral world, where the two primary alchemical reagents, the ones you all know about, mercury and sulfur, were considered to be Shiva's semen and the goddess's menstrual or uterine blood, or her fluid of orgasm. The alchemist's work was to purify and potentiate these two minerals in order to appropriate and manipulate their procreative and transformative energies. And it's in this context we can interpret these Mughal miniatures, which are a pictorial representation of instructions found in, as I said, about 7 Tantric alchemical works for how to extract mercury from the wells in which it is naturally found. And here are those instructions in full. A maiden who has had her first menstrual bath, dressed as if for a wedding, rides on horseback past a well of mercury. Sensing her presence, the mercury comes rushing out of the well and attempts to seize her. But she rides off with the mercury in hot pursuit. At some point, the mercury tries to return to the well, but alchemists in that country have dug troughs across its path. Caught in its troughs, it cannot progress any further, and the alchemists then place that mercury in a sublimation apparatus and extract the pure mercury. Sublimation apparatus is basically the 2-chambered gourd that Stephen just showed you examples of. They're not gourds in India, they're made of Cerner stuff because you've got to light fires under them, and it's basically a very primitive still, and I'll show you a picture of a schematic of one. These sources also tell us where the well of mercury is located and how the mercury came to reside in that well there. It's said to be located in a country called Cinnabar land, far to the west of the Himalayas. And that's why you see the people in the background dressed in European garb, because it's way off to the west, the exotic west. Cinnabar, as you know, is the ore from which mercury is extracted. It's mercuric sulfide, HGS, compound of mercury and sulfur. It occurs in trace quantities at sites of geothermal activity, and the purest forms of cinnabar are bright, brilliant red in color. How mercury came to reside in Cinnabar land, in that well, is the subject of an origin myth found in 4 of the principal alchemical works. And that myth is a spin-off of the Hindu myth of the birth of Skanda, the boy god, who's the son of Shiva. So I have to tell you this myth. Hindu mythology is rich, and it's also very, very surreal. And when I tell you the plot of this myth, you'll understand why there are no pictorial or sculptural representations of it anywhere. But this image should give you an idea of that merging of Eros and Thanatos, that Tantric imagery so often combined, both in writing and in pictures. So that myth, it always begins, like so many of these Hindu myths, with the eternal battle between the gods and their rivals, the anti-gods, the asuras. At this time, the gods are having the worst of it, because an asura, a demon named Taraka, has performed such fierce religious austerities, asceticism, that he's threatening to burn up the entire universe just by his body heat. So one of the gods, Brahma, who's always sort of the fall guy in these stories, he gives Taraka a boon. He says, if you'll stop heating up the universe, you can have any boon you choose. So Taraka says, okay, I will be invincible to any but a son born of Shiva, because he thinks he's got the gods snookered here. Why is that? Because Shiva is a god always represented with an erection, but that doesn't mean he ever ejaculates. In fact, his erection, that still, calm pillar of male procreative energy, is what maintains the balance of the entire universe. And he spends most of his time meditating in a cave at the highest peak of the Himalayas, Mount Kailas, alone or with his spouse, but she's just meditating too, it would seem. And that's where this story begins, because the gods need to get Shiva to finally ejaculate. He can't keep it in this time. He's got to give it up so that a boy will be born that can defeat this demon. So they send a messenger to Shiva, Agni, the god of fire, in the form of a pigeon. And he says, please, Shiva, give it up this time. Please, have an orgasm. Well, Shiva starts going at it with the goddess, and it lasts for hundreds of years. He's got this incredible yogic concentration that it's just a habit with him. He's worse than Sting, He just cannot ever have so several hundred years later, Agni comes to the same mountain cave where they're still going at it, and there's like a window, and he looks through the window, and actually the window has a pane of glass or something, and so he pecks on the glass with his beak. And Shiva gets distracted for a moment, and he pulls out, says, what? And that's at that moment that he ejaculates. And Agni, who's in the form of this pigeon, catches Shiva's semen in his beak, and you think that fire could, handle the heat of Shiva's semen, but it's really even too hot for fire to handle. So Agni's flying across the sky with this burning semen in his beak, and finally he gets to the Ganges River, and it all just falls out of his mouth. Lands on the shore of the Ganges in a thicket of reeds, and immediately when that semen hits the water, well, the Ganges is a goddess. All the rivers are goddesses in India. And that mixture of the goddess's essence and Shiva's essence, immediately a baby boy emerges out of that mass. And he's lying there in the bulrushes, and 6 divine women are immediately attracted to this lovely boy lying there. And they approach him, they begin to lactate immediately, and offer their breast to him. And he does what any male would do, even though he's just a few hours old. He grows 6 heads so he can suck all their breasts at once. And that is why Skanda has 6 heads. And he grows up to be a man in like 7 days, and he defeats the enemy demon, and that's the end of the story. That's the backstory to why Mercury got in the well that you saw. Because in these alchemical texts, what they say is, well, Agni couldn't stand the intensity of Shiva's semen, even as he was flying toward the Ganges, so drips and drops fell out of his mouth in 5 different places, and when they hit the ground, they burrowed deep into the earth and became these wells of mercury. And alchemists knew that they had to get to those wells to get the mercury out of the ground. And so that's sort of that image of the woman riding on horseback past the well is presupposing. Here it bears noting that before burrowing down into those wells, the source of mercury, Shiva's semen, began at the top of the highest mountain. I'll come back to that. This identification of mercury with Shiva's semen has a logic to it. Mercury is a fluid element with remarkable properties, the same as the case with Shiva's semen. But there's more, because just as mercury is the most volatile of the minerals and metals, occurring in a liquid form at room temperature when pure, but as I learned in Ayurvedic Chem Lab at Benares University in the early 1990s, evaporating and becoming a noxious toxic vapor at the lowest temperature of any metal, 357 centigrade, when exposed to fire or heat, so like mercury, which is volatile, in most males, semen is a highly volatile element, occurring in liquid form at room temperature, but also exploding out of most male penises when exposed to the heat of a woman's vulva, whence one of my favorite poems from Middle Indo-Aryan poetry, a poem attributed to the great 12th century Hatha yogi Gorakhnath, which reads, Bhag mushi ling, ag mushi para, jo rashe so guru hamara, penis in the vulva's mouth, mercury in fire, he who preserves both is the one I call my guru. So Shiva's lingam, imperturbable even in the course of hundreds of years of sexual intercourse due to his powers of meditative concentration, save for this one occasion where he ejaculated, he gave it up for the team, is an emblem of a certain tantric ideal of coitus reservatus, although, as I will show you later, tantric gurus sometimes also gave it up for the team, known in tantric parlance as the kula, the tantric family or clan. But I'm coming ahead of myself here. This is the subliminal message of Shiva's standard worship image called a lingam, a term that means, among other things, phallus. In the Tantric age, lingam styles were altered to highlight, I should say that the one on the left is actually pre-Tantric, but as you can see, it's anatomically correct. You can see the vein that runs up the side and so forth. The lower part is not anatomically correct. I've never seen a penis with 8 sides at the lower end. But, in the Tantric age, a change appears in which the lingam is inscribed in a yoni, a vulva. And this is the standard worship image of Shiva in India down to the present day. It's a penis engaged in a vulva. And this was a style that was altered in the Tantric age to highlight this sexualized understanding of the creative power of the dyad of Shiva and the goddess, the lingam yoni, which is worshipped as such throughout India down to our times. Now, there's also an origin myth for sulfur, which is the mineral analog to the menstrual or uterine blood of the goddess, just as semen is of the god Shiva. And that, too, has a backstory from a Hindu myth that was evoked by a questioner here a short time ago. It begins with sulfur originating at the bottom of the deepest ocean. So you have mercury coming from the top of the highest mountain, sulfur from the bottom of the deepest ocean. And recall here that so many mystic paths, like so many mystic paths, this involves what's called the coincidentia oppositorum, the coincidence of opposites. Male, female, high, low, they come together in the alchemist laboratory and they generate something really special. So the backstory to the origin of sulfur is this myth of the churning of the ocean of milk, and I think this is the loveliest pictorial representation of that. It's a bit blurry, I'm afraid, in this reproduction. It comes from Bikaner in western part of Rajasthan, almost at the border with Pakistan. I mention that because that is the archive, the royal archive that has the richest collection of alchemical manuscripts on the planet, which I had the good fortune of being able to consult in its entirety in 1992. I may be the only person on the planet since the 17th century when this collection was put together to have had that fortunate privilege, because when I got there in 92, that library, which is housed in a royal palace that was converted into a luxury hotel, was part of a probate lawsuit. The children of the now dead Maharaja were fighting over his legacy, and that library was an important part of it. So it had been closed for many years. I learned it had been opened. I got there as quickly as I could. I saw everything. You couldn't photograph, you just had to take notes. There's a few hundred alchemical manuscripts there. And then they closed the place again a year later, and it's been closed ever since. I was satisfied that the manuscripts I saw there didn't contain anything that wasn't already extant either in manuscripts found in other archives or in published form or both. So in fact, it's wonderful that there are so many of them there. It's too bad they're not all none of them are accessible. But in fact, the juiciest alchemical texts are the ones that you can find in other archives and that have been published, and those I've read in total over the years. So this story is briefly put, again, cast in the background of this eternal battle between their gods and their enemies, the asuras. But in this case, both of them are in danger because they've lost the amrita, the nectar of immortality, and without that, even the gods and the anti-gods are mortal. So faced with mutual extinction, they agree to cooperate for once, and really this is the for once of Hindu mythology. Of course, they start fighting as soon as they get the nectar. But as the story goes, they make a pact to churn the ocean of milk using a mountain as the churning stick and a serpent as the churning rope and a tortoise to support the mountain at the bottom of the ocean of milk, because they've been told that at the bottom of that ocean are, among other things, the nectar of immortality, but also the objects that you see, the six-tusked elephant that Indra rides, a wish-fulfilling tree, a wish-fulfilling cow, a magical horse with 6 heads. There's the nectar there. And in this story, they churn the ocean, the nectar comes up from the bottom of it, and they start fighting over it right away, and the gods trick the anti-gods, and they get the ambrosia, the amrita, and they remain immortal, and so it's gods 2, demons 0. They lost both those battles that I just described to you. So this is the backstory to the origin myth of sulfur, which is simply that sometime before the churning of the ocean of milk, the goddess was swimming around in the ocean and she had her period. And so some of her uterine blood, her menstrual blood, flooded into the ocean of milk and fell to the bottom of that ocean. So when they churned that ocean, not only did the things you see in this picture come up, but so too did her menstrual blood. And when it came up, everyone, the gods, and by the way, this is a very sympathetic depiction of the demons. Usually they have animal heads and fangs and stuff. They really look quite fine here. When the goddess's menstrual blood reaches the surface of the ocean of milk, everyone says, boy, does that stink. Well, actually they say aromatic, or fragrant. And the word in Sanskrit is gandhaka, which means sulfur. Therefore, her menstrual blood is known as sulfur in the world, which is aromatic, at least in these sort of geothermal places where you often find, sulfur baths and so forth, where you often find trace amounts of mercury precisely, and I'll come back to that. So these are the origin myths of the 2 principal reagents of the Hindu Tantric Alchemists' laboratory work, and they are the mineral form of the sexual emissions of the 2 principal creators and maintainers of the Tantric universe. As such, in the laboratory, the Tantric alchemist was essentially creating the cosmic zygote, which, when he absorbed it into his body, transformed him into a living god, a second Shiva, outliving the gods and the universe, and possessed of supernatural powers. There's an aphorism from the greatest of the alchemical works of the Tantric tradition called the Rasarnava Tantra, the Tantra of the flood or the ocean of Mercury. There's an aphorism from this 11th century work which basically describes the watchword of Tantric alchemical practice, which says, as in metal, so in the body, first test mercury on metals, then use it on the body. So the Tantric alchemist, by testing out mercury on metals and transmuting them into gold, that was the test. If it transmuted into gold, well, then it was okay to ingest it at that point. He could then absorb that same mercury and transform his biologically given body into a golden or diamond or perfected or realized siddha body, very close to the Zhen word in Chinese alchemy, same sort of idea here. A body that was ever youthful, invulnerable, supernatural, and immortal, a siddha body, which tracked perfectly with the goals of broader Tantra, which were twofold, but the second fold is the one I want to talk about. What distinguished Tantric practice from, let's say, more mainstream, although Tantra was the mainstream for several hundred years in South Asia was this pursuit of siddhis, supernatural powers. And so alchemy was one way to get those powers. Others were things like yoga and sexual magic that I'll come back to again and again. And also a kind of suicide that resulted in the generation of a siddha body, a perfected body. So the alchemical body is very likely the basis for the yogic body. The early works of Goraknath, one of the founders of Hatha Yoga, they're rife with alchemical references. The one I just read to you about penis in the vulva's mouth, mercury and fire is attributed to him. And basically what you have is a bipolar system in a very rudimentary alchemical apparatus. You have heat down below, you have the mash of cinnabar and other elements in the lower chamber. They evaporate into the upper chamber. You've got a cooling vessel on top of the upper chamber so that when that mercury vapor touches the inner surface of the upper chamber, it condenses, becomes beads of pure quicksilver, and that's the good stuff, and what remains below is basically the dross, what's left over. If the mercury drips down back into the lower chamber, it's going to re-evaporate, so eventually the alchemist cracks open his vessel and he takes out the pure mercury. In the human yogic body, you've got the heat down below. That's the heat you generate from your yogic practice. Shakti, the kundalini, it's female, it's solar. And then you have lunar semen up above. Through your yogic practice, you raise your semen. It eventually becomes nectar in the cranial vault because it's gone through this thermodynamic heating process as it rises along the spinal column. And so in the end, your head is full of semen, which is now nectar, and you drink it internally, and you become immortal in that way. So in this respect, the body is an alchemical apparatus, and it's also the sun and the moon. The ones that are up there are in here, and it's also male and female. And so here you have a couple of ways of talking about that or looking at it. It's also, the body is considered to be two wells, a downturned well, which is lunar, and upturned well, that is solar. And so that story about Mercury rushing out of its wells also has this reference in the background too. Male and female I've mentioned, solar lunar I've mentioned, uterine blood semen, yeah, it's all there, the different aspects of it. So that's the case with the body as well as with the alchemical apparatus. They're doubles for one another. And this bipolarity of male semen above, female sulfur below, even plays out on a geographical scale, as I learned during a 1984 pilgrimage that I took to Kedarnath, a Shiva temple located in the fairly high Himalayas. It's at the foot of 22,000-foot peaks. It is around 12,000. Kedarnath is a Shiva temple. It has a naturally occurring lingam in its sanctum, not one that was crafted by human hands. And it's at the foot of some of the highest peaks in the world, which are again identified as the dwelling place of Shiva. So you've got Kedarnath basically at the end of the pilgrim's route. As you make your way up there, if you do the full route, or I should say if you did the full route, because there was a terrible landslide at Kedarnath 5-10 years ago, and it wiped out everything except the temple. All the guest houses, the hotels, the bazaar, and scores of people were killed, and it altered the pilgrimage route. So I don't really know if this lower feature of the pilgrimage is one that is still doable, but it's to my point. About 10 miles as you walk and 1,000 feet in elevation below the temple, below Kedarnath, you would come first to a site called Gauri Kund, the pool of the fair goddess, Gauri being one of the names of Shiva's divine consort. And actually there's more than one pool there, and they are stinky and sulfurous and hot. And one of them is called Ritu Kund, which means the menses pool. And it contains water that's especially red in color. And all around this cluster of pools are soil that's tinged reddish yellow due to the high sulfur content. And you can bathe not in the menses pool, because it really is too vile, but in the Gauri Kund, the fair goddess pool. This is it. It's the most sort of shabby chic spa you'll ever bathe in. I went there on when the opening of the temple occurs each year, when the snows melt enough for you to walk up to it. There's a major procession that lasts for 3 days. And on the second day, you come to this. And that's the day they open the spigots. And I don't think they cleaned up the basin from the year before. So you kind of hunker down there, and everybody's got their clothes on. India has become a lot less tantric than it once was. And then the hot water, this hot sulfurous water comes shooting out, and everybody gets wet, and then you start walking further up the trail. So down below, sulfurous pool, Menzies pool, and then when you get up to the temple itself, according to pilgrim guides that you can buy in the bazaar there, which cites Puranas, scriptures from the medieval period, behind the temple, but I never found it, is a little spring that's called the mercurial pool. So Mercury above, sulfur below, Shiva above, goddess below. It's so on a sort of geographical scale, you have this same bipolarity thing working itself out. So even if that pool doesn't exist in the real world, it had to be there in this idealized system. In passing, I should say that Tantric alchemy was highly sophisticated in terms of its science, its laboratory techniques, its use of mineralogical, pharmacological reagents. Its pharmacopoeia was massive, and much of it has been taken over by Ayurveda, of which a subdivision is called Ras Shastra, the teachings on the essential elements, which is basically Tantric alchemy, just repurposed to now be used for Ayurvedic therapy, as opposed to the more lofty goals of bodily immortality and transmutation of base metals into gold. And that's why I was in the Ayurvedic chem lab when we got driven out one time by mercury vapors, because that's where I learned about how you do the stuff. This was at Banaras Hindu University. One of the places in India where they actually made gold from base metals in an alchemical experiment that was documented, and maybe they did. Although the one person I interviewed who was present at that experiment, the one that took place in the 40s, I interviewed him in the late 80s, and by then he was an old man. He said that the alchemist, who was an Ayurveda professor himself, he identified everything he put into the mix except one item, and maybe it was gold. However, he also said that it costs much more to make gold alchemically than to just go buy it in the marketplace. And he also said that the alchemist who made that gold spent all his money at the horses afterwards, and that he was killed by someone because they tried to extort the secrets out of him. And so it's a dangerous vocation. But returning to Tantric alchemy and its homologization of mercury and sulfur with Shiva's semen and the goddess's menstrual or uterine blood. This also played out in the alchemical laboratory in the person of the alchemist's female lab assistant, of which there were 4 ideal types, who had names like Cowrie Maiden and Lotus Maiden. How is she described? The first thing they say about her is she's got nice pubic hair, so you're not in Kansas anymore. And then that she's dark-complected and well-proportioned and fair of speech and light of laughter and gentle when she kisses and embraces, a lover of dairy products and a devotee of Shiva. But her most important feature is not visible to the naked eye because, as a number of the texts tell us, the Cowrie Maiden is known because her menstrual flow occurs during the dark half of the lunar month, while the Lotus Maiden menstruates either on the new moon or the full moon, and so on. Why is this important? Because as one alchemical work tells us, she who flowers, who has her period, in the dark half of the lunar month is most excellent for the fixation of mercury in alchemical practice. So once again, you see this transferal from mineral to sexual, but now they're human sexual fluids, not divine ones. It goes on to say, for 21 days, she is to eat sulfur mixed with clarified butter, that's the lover of dairy products part, and then her menstrual blood becomes efficacious for the fixation and calcination of mercury. Other texts instruct the alchemist to place that mercury wrapped in a piece of cloth deep in his partner's vulva, so it must have been dangerous to have been an alchemical assistant too, to the same end, or to marinate sulfur in menstrual blood to increase its potency. It is the logic of these alchemical analogs that make the practice work, in theory, at any rate. So why this fixation on female sexual fluids, but female ones in particular? Much of tantric practice, especially the practice whose goal was the attainment of supernatural powers, hinged on the magical and sacramental use of male and female sexual fluids. In the case of the female fluid, there were several code words for it in the tantric lexicon. One of them, my favorite, was sadbhava, the real thing, the good stuff. Here, the tantric consort was considered to be an embodiment of the great goddess herself, and the male guru, the embodiment of Shiva. Therefore, their sexual fluids were none other than the creative, transformative fluids of the divine. So, tantric initiation, this is a blurry photo for two reasons. One, it's taken on because all pornographic photos should be blurry, right? It's taken of a sculpture high up on the wall of a temple in Kathmandu, and also it was taken by the shaky hand of a friend of mine, and not by my steady hand. A friend of mine who teaches in CSU San Diego, Staneshvar Timilsina, a Nepali who knows more about Tantra than just about anybody else on the planet, and is a practitioner. Tantric initiation involved the absorption of sexual fluids by an initiate, and that's what you see here. Guru, consort, sexual intercourse, he's catching what drips out of her in this chalice, and that is what he needs to absorb. Now, we're not sure if that's just her orgasmic fluid that he drinks, or whether it's the combined fluids of the two, because there are conflicting reports of this. Sometimes both are necessary. Other times the guru just brings her to orgasm, and that's what's collected. In either case, though, to become a member of this tantric family, this clan, there's literally a flow chart that flows from the fluids of Shiva and the goddess through demigods and goddesses down to human gurus and their consorts. So for you to become part of that family, you have to be inseminated or insanguinated with that essence, and this is how it happened. So this is why female sexual fluid in particular is so important in the tantric quest. So once again, tantric initiation was what empowered an initiate to eventually become a siddha, a perfected being with the youthful, invulnerable, supernaturally powerful body, and immortal body. And once again, the symmetry with alchemical practice is perfect. By absorbing the sexual fluids of the divine in their perfect mineral form, the alchemist was transformed into a siddha, a perfected being. And this generally entailed a beautiful, eternally youthful, immortal body, residence in the atmospheric region high above the earth, but below the heaven of the gods, because you didn't want to go to heaven and just hang out with the gods. You wanted to be able to move around, be yourself, fly through the air, have sex with divine maidens, and so forth. Every sort of gratification, of which sexual was an important component. There are virtually, just as there are virtually no images of alchemists and alchemical practices from the tantric period, the same is true of siddhas, these perfected beings. This is a possible depiction of them, also from Khajuraho. I say this for a couple reasons. On the one hand, it's located very high up on the temple wall, and the higher you go, the closer to heaven you are. Also, it's a depiction of the world known as Brahma Loka, which is the world of the transcendent absolute, which is right at the top of the cosmic egg, and that's Brahma representing that. And these are probably his 4 yogically born sons, who are sort of the divine prototypes for all Hindu yogis and practitioners of Tantra and so forth. Yogis who are depicted here quite appropriately for this period as warriors carrying weapons, because yogis were mercenaries much more than they were peaceful, meditative sorts back in those days. And their tantra was also a way to gain the power to fight and be victorious in battle. Also, you've got divine musicians up there, and there's a lot of great music up in heaven. And so these are all clues to that possibility that this is a depiction of siddhas at the top of the universe. This is a Jain image, so it's not tantric, but it certainly involves a siddha. The Jains also, they didn't have gods, or gods didn't count in Jainism. The gods were not worshipped, and the founders of Jainism, the Tirthamkaras, were not gods, and they didn't care if you worshipped them because they were totally dispassionate, and they were also impervious to worship. But if you, as a practitioner, wanted to sort of leave this world of suffering existence, the best way was to fast unto death. And here you see a Jain saint who has just reached that stage. He's sitting on a mountaintop. He's being cheered on by his community. Yeah, go ahead, die, dude. He's going to die of starvation. And then he immediately rises up to the top of the universe. And we know that because the Siddha world is located in the hollow of a crescent moon that's turned up this way at the top of the universe. So this is a representation of a Jain Siddha, a perfected being, which is the most one could expect for in the Jain universe. While the alchemical canon is replete with descriptions of this sort of transformation into a Siddha, usually through the ingestion of these alchemical substances, perfected mercury, none is as dramatic as that found in the concluding verses of the 11th century classic I already mentioned, the Rasarnava Tantra, the Tantra of the flood of mercury. Here, however, the transformation requires some extra effort on the part of the alchemist, as is made clear in the final 17 verses of the work, which come after a description of how to make what is called diamond-bound mercury, the summum alchemicum of this tantric alchemical text. This alchemist knows his mercury is diamond-bound when he sees it restoring all sorts of cripples to wholeness and transmuting 10 million times its mass of base metals into gold. It takes a lifetime, if not longer, which is always the sort of catch-22 here, of alchemical procedures carried out without a flaw to produce diamond-bound mercury. And now that he has it, the alchemist is faced with a choice. He can keep the gold, or, like in those silly game shows, he can bet it all and go for what's behind the curtain. And the greater payout here, the ultimate payout, is described in these 17 final verses. And I'll read some of them verbatim, I'll summarize some of them. A beautiful shining, and this should also remind you of some of the things Stephen was saying. A beautiful shining copper vessel shall be the measure of the alchemist in height and half his size in diameter. He should install a square wooden frame on top of it. He should smear the inside of the cauldron with diamond-bound mercury, clarified butter, and oil rendered from human fat. That's also the tantric world, in equal proportions. After worshiping the cauldron, he should venerate the divine regents of the four directions. He should then worship a virgin. After that, he should likewise make tribute offerings on each of the 8 compass points. Next, he should slowly pump the bellows on the 4 sides of the cauldron. It should become very hot. And when it has stopped smoking, the alchemist should, after bowing to his guru and his god, the sun, the moon, and likewise the planets, and after worshiping the entire group of lunar mansions, jump in. So he jumps into this cauldron of boiling oil, and then the text, I'm going to read it in verbatim, you'll understand what it's driving at. It now describes the transformation of his body now that he's jumped into this boiling mass. It says, one should consider the alchemical equivalents of earth and water and fire and air and ether, that's the 5 elements, as very difficult to obtain. One should work to produce a body possessed of supernatural powers. Everything in the cauldron will become a gelatinous mass. Now we're introduced to a male laboratory assistant that's necessary for this operation. He should first throw in the alchemical equivalent of water down into the cauldron. He will note the red color, probably blood forming. He should then add fire into this mass. At this point, there should be a ball of flesh. Thereupon, he should cast air into the cauldron. The desired outward appearance should follow. That probably means the outlines of a body. And finally, he should cast ether into the now newly manifested skull that he sees forming in the cauldron. He should then reduce to ashes that newly formed body, perhaps, which is being melted by blowing and which has the appearance of gold. And at this point, the alchemist rises up out of the cauldron, possessed of a perfect alchemical body, and here's a description of that body. Emitting the sound of the great Hum mantra that is revered by the gods, he whose body is massive and shines like the sun rises up. Possessed of great strength, he has the power of divine sight. He is now mounted in a celestial chariot, the peal of whose venerable bell spreads over 900 miles. It is wrought in flaming gold, sparkling with divine gemstones and rubies, ornamented with flowered garlands and banners and decorated with a mesh of tiny bells. A divine maiden, decked out in divine finery and adorned in divine garlands, perfectly conversant in the erotic delights and trembling with sexual desire, comes to him to the accompaniment of bewitching sounds of conches and musical instruments, nymphin melodies, song, and dance. And after taking him, the best of practitioners, into her embrace, she dwells with him in the world of the siddhas, the perfected ones, forever. There he takes delight in heavenly baths, liqueurs, and divine finery, and there he finds love-starved siddha maidens by the hundreds of thousands. And he's got immortality, so he can try every one of them, right? And as if that were not enough, wait, there's more. When all creatures, both mobile and immobile, have perished in the terrible doomsday flood below, the universal destruction at the end of an age, the perfected alchemist remains perched above the destruction in the abode of the gods. But then comes the fine print, the last verse. If, however, the process cannot be completed, then success will be achieved in another body, in a future life. Means he got burned to a crisp, it didn't work out. But because of his effort, he's going to be reborn as an alchemist, and he'll have another lifetime to get it right. Now, what makes this instruction from the Rasarnavam so interesting is the fact that it's also found in another 11th century source, a description of the alchemists of India penned by the Muslim scholar al-Biruni. His version, however, dramatizes those instructions, makes them into a narrative, transforming them into a lesson on thinking twice when a tantric alchemist shows up at your door. And here's that story. In the city of Dhara, the capital of the kingdom of Malava, all of this, the alchemical texts, the alchemists that little we know of them, the pharmacopoeia, the mythology, they all point to the west coast of India, from Gujarat in the north down to Karnataka in the south. Probably because of trade routes where the raw materials came from, also because it was facing towards Persia, where probably India borrowed more of its alchemical knowledge than it did from China, which is not to say that India didn't generate its own alchemical techniques and so forth that were quite exceptional. So back to the story. In the city of Dhara, the capital of the kingdom of Malava, there lies in the door of the government house an oblong piece of pure silver, in which the outlines of the limbs of a man are visible. Its origin is accounted for in the following story. Once in olden times, a man went to a king of theirs, bringing him a rasayana, an elixir, the use of which would make him immortal, victorious, invincible, and capable of doing everything he desired. He asked the king to come alone to the place of their meeting, and the king gave orders to keep in readiness all the man required. The man began to boil the oil for several days, until at last it acquired consistency. Then he spoke to the king, "Spring into it, and I shall finish the process." But the king, terrified at what he saw, had not the courage to dive into it. The man, on perceiving his cowardice, spoke to him, and he said, "If you don't have the courage and will not do it for yourself, will you allow me myself to do it?" Whereupon the king answered, "Do as you like." Now the alchemist produced several packets of drugs and instructed the king that when such and such a symptom should appear, he should throw upon him this or that packet. Then the man stepped forward into the cauldron and threw himself into it, and at once he was dissolved and reduced to a pulp. Now the king proceeded according to his instruction. But when he had nearly finished the process, and there remained only one packet that was not yet thrown into the mass, he began to be anxious and think what might happen to his realm in case the man should return to life as an immortal, victorious, invincible being. And so he thought it preferable not to throw the last packet into the mass. And the consequence was that the cauldron became cold, and the dissolved man became consolidated in the shape of the piece of silver in the doorway of the government building. So this was another sort of alchemical immortality, the transformation of the alchemist into a work of art. Thank you.